I'm going to talk about a very venerable SLS project. I think it started sometime in 2011. We got a publication in 2017, and just about everybody has worked on it at some stage. There's some names here, there's some names at the end. There are other people I know of that have been involved. So if you've been involved, thank you very much. It started out to look, it was called a comparative study of the relationship between deprivation and health status in Northern Ireland and Scotland. Now, some of the research questions were centred around the Scottish effect. And I'm not sure those ever really got done, but it looks like Frank has done them anyway, so that's okay. But another strand of the work was looking at the relationship between religion, religious denomination, and mortality in the respective countries. Now, there's a couple of reasons you might want to look at religion and mortality. Firstly, there's the link between religious affiliation and health behaviours. So some work in Northern Ireland showed that people in very conservative, this case Christian denominations, were much less likely to die of alcohol or tobacco-related illnesses. So that makes sense. There's also an issue of ethnicity going on here, so that in both of these countries, religion might in some way give an indication of an ethnic background. So in Scotland, the Catholic population, quite a large proportion of those could also be described as white Irish ethnicity. And in Northern Ireland, the Catholics would be Irish again, but many of the Protestant people would be Lowland Scots that have moved across. And there's a lot of interchange between these two populations, so there's ethnicity involved as well. And another reason to look at it is the interrelations between these communities. So in Northern Ireland, everybody knows that religion is a big issue, and especially sectarianism, and there's a sort of long history of looking at these relations. And the particular areas we were looking at are to do with socioeconomic status and then its influence on mortality. So in Northern Ireland, the story was that for a long time Protestants were in the ascendancy, and they sort of controlled areas of the public life and had the best jobs, and then the Catholics had a lower socioeconomic status, which was reflected in higher mortality. But the more positive side to that was it was thought that the narrative was that after the Good Friday agreements and the various legal changes over time, perhaps Catholics had increased social mobility and then better outcomes from mortality as well. But this wasn't really being discussed in Scotland until about the turn of the millennium, when you had it suddenly hit the headlines, and you had books like this coming out to say, okay, sectarianism, we think it really is an issue. And there were various researchers that highlighted Catholic disadvantage in certain industries. So our project was based on wanting to see whether this had filtered up to the level of mortality. People had sort of started to look around their status, socioeconomic status, but did this actually influence mortality, or was it a bit of a red herring? And this debate may have also had something to do with why the Scottish census suddenly included these questions on religion from 2001. And this gives us the opportunity that we were looking for. So in the data set that we used, we started with the 2001 census, and we can see the breakdown here by the different religious categories. So you can see that in Northern Ireland, then there's a much larger proportion of the population are Catholic, and in Scotland, so we've got 38% in Northern Ireland, and only 16% Catholic in Scotland in the sample that we used. So we're also looking at whether the balance of these proportions has some influence on the outcomes. So you've got two almost equally sized groups in Ireland, and you have a much smaller minority here in Scotland of the Catholic group. This leads us to the three research questions. So firstly, is there any evidence that Catholics are more disadvantaged? You know, that's the story that was coming up, but is there really any evidence for it? Are there differences in mortality risk amongst these groups? And how does that differ between the countries? And if there are differences, to what extent does the different socioeconomic status influence that. So as Chris mentioned in the introduction, then we did this using eData Shield. So basically we have the two longitudinal studies, the SLS and the NILS, and we've got a sample from each. This is adults ages 25 to 74, and there's good large numbers in each of them. We were following up mortality for almost 7 years of follow-up, but we wanted to analyze these data sets as if they were together, as if they were in the same place. And of course, you can't do that by transferring data, or the registrars general will unleash wrath upon you. So the technical solution that Gillian and her team have developed is where some statistical code and some completely non-disclosive summaries of the data are transferred between the relative safe settings in each country, and they specify the statistical models you're fitting, and you send them backwards and forwards by email until eventually the models converge, and you can find your results, and you can make formal statistical comparisons where you otherwise couldn't. So this is the sort of the clever bit of it. So let's have a look now at some of the results. So the next few slides are looking at the socioeconomic measures that we use, and these are just proportions here, so they're just percentages of the different populations. Now, in each case, we're looking at the differences within each country in the sizes of the bars. So to illustrate here, if we're looking at the differences in educational attainment, we're looking at the gap between Catholics and Protestants. Now, in Scotland here, we can see that Catholics are more likely to have no qualifications than Protestants. There's almost a 5% gap, the first of those purple arrows, and they're less likely to have the higher qualification, the degree. Now, if you then move your view across to those same columns in Northern Ireland, you see that there's no gap. So they have overall a much higher probability of having no qualifications, but there's no difference between the groups. So there's a discrepancy in Scotland, but not in Northern Ireland in this case. There's a similar story here for housing tenure. So if you look in Scotland, you can see there's an 8% gap, so Catholics are less likely to own their own home and more likely to be in social rented accommodation. Now, there's some evidence of the gap for owner occupation in Northern Ireland, but it's smaller again. So again, the baselines may be different between the two countries, but the gaps were bigger here in Scotland. Moving on to access to household cars, we sometimes use this as a measure of, accumulated wealth, something like that. Now here, there's very little difference. So you can see that there are Protestant Catholic gaps, but they're about the same in both countries. Now, car ownership is a lot higher in Scotland anyway, but those gaps, the relative differences are around the same. So we don't find an extra disadvantage for this outcome. For social class, if anything, it's going perhaps slightly the other way. You can see the largest gap on this graph here is in Northern Ireland, where the Catholics are much more likely to be long-term unemployed. Although I will mention that the group in all of the countries most likely to be unemployed was Catholics in Scotland. But there's a very small gap between the two in Scotland. So there's a somewhat mixed bag here. For education and housing tenure, there appears to be a greater Catholic disadvantage in Scotland, and that's less clear for the other two outcomes, car availability and social class. So to move on now to the mortality gaps. So how have any of these effects worked their way up to influence death rates? Now here we're looking at incidence rate ratios. So everything is compared to a baseline group, which in this case are Protestants in each country. So the line going across the one is the Protestant level, and then all of the other groups are compared against that. Now, I will mention that these are all brought to the same scale, so we did find a Scottish effect, and if you were to have them on the same scale, all of the Scottish points would be higher, including the baseline, but for these purposes I brought them together so we can see the differences between groups within countries. So if you look now in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, there is no statistically significant difference. This is just crude mortality, it's no adjustment going on here. But in Scotland there is a difference, and there is higher mortality for both men and women amongst Catholics. And it's quite a large difference, 39% for men, 29% for women. But what about once we've adjusted for the different socioeconomic status? So you can see here that in Northern Ireland, the story is the same. There's no difference between the two groups for either men or women. In Scotland, the same effect we saw before, but it's been much attenuated. This very often happens in this type of research. And we can see that the gaps now have been reduced to only 14% and 12%, so not that big, but they are still statistically significant. So we have pretty good evidence that there are these small gaps between the groups in terms of mortality risk. So to summarize these findings, we have some evidence that Catholics are more disadvantaged, but it's mixed. So yes for education and housing tenure, and not for the other measures. There is some evidence that Catholics have higher mortality than Protestants in Scotland, but this pattern was not observed in Northern Ireland, which is perhaps surprising given the amount of conflict between the groups over there. And we have evidence that once you adjust for socioeconomic status, then these gaps decrease. So instead of being a really big mortality differential, it's quite modest when we've adjusted for these differences. So we tried to think of what the explanations for this might be, and I advanced this more as a hypothesis than an explanation, because there are many other ways that you could try and explain this. And one thing we thought of is perhaps it is to do with the legislation that has been enacted in the two countries over time. So in Northern Ireland, to deal with that sort of Protestant ascendancy, then as far back as the 70s, legislation was introduced to try and equalize employment practices to make sure that both groups were represented adequately. This continued. There was another act in '89, and then a flurry of activity around '98, around the time of the Good Friday Peace Agreement. And this Northern Ireland Act, Section 75, means that every public body has to consider how its actions will influence or not influence two groups, and make sure everyone is treated fairly in any major decision that they make. So it's quite strong legislation. In contrast, in Scotland, you had to wait till 2010 when an Equality Act came in, which does deal with a lot of these areas, but it's a lot later. So we advanced this as a possible explanation. Perhaps this is why we saw these differences. So then the fun started. The paper came out in Health and Place, one of my favourite journals, some very interesting things written there. And it got picked up. So the Scotsman picked it up first. The Belfast Telegraph always concentrates on the money. And then the fun really started when the Herald decided to get involved, and one of the top historians came and rubbished the study. And my favourite is we were declared as historically illiterate, which is it's a good moment when that's happening. There's probably some truth in that. We're not historians. The main bound for controversy and the main argument made against this was that this is a problem in the past. So they were accepting that, yes, there had been discrimination in both countries in the past, but now it was all getting better, and that in fact what we were showing is just yesterday's problem. And why is it still being talked about? How could it help to bring this up again and stir up old wounds, etc.? And so I suppose that then begs the question, if this is yesterday's problem, then why did we still see those differentials in socioeconomic status? And also, why did it create such a stir? If this is something that doesn't matter anymore, then why did we suddenly get all these people getting excited and phoning up and all the rest of it? But they were right in that perhaps this is something that needs to be looked at further. And so the obvious thing to do now would be to try this again, because this is 2001 data, and things have moved on in 10 years, and data quality act has come in. So perhaps it's time to try using the 2011 census or even some admin data to see whether this is changing and whether this is in fact a positive story of improvement rather than a negative one of continued sectarian divide. So I thank my various other people that I know were involved at some point, and the two support teams here. And the other advantage of using Data Shield and doing a joint project is that you can lay bets on which team is going to clear your outputs quicker. Thank you very much.